Hello, I am David Ringstrom, a CPE in Atlanta, and welcome to our presentation that will introduce you to the concept of pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. If you're not presently using pivot tables, and I recently saw a stat published by Microsoft that 80% of Excel users have never created a pivot table. That's quite a startling statistic, and I think by the end of the presentation, you'll have a much better sense of why pivot tables should often be part of your repertoire in Microsoft Excel. What pivot tables allow us to do is to take lists of data and then instantly transform them into summary reports. If we're not using pivot tables, then there's much that we're doing the hard way because we're having to go about taking lists of data, eliminating duplicates, using formulas to try to summarize the data into totals. And with pivot tables, all that goes out the window. We are simply dragging and dropping things with our mouse. Reports instantly appear on the screen. So we get that instant feedback, and so it frees us up to experiment more with our data and try rearranging it in different ways, because often if you just take the data and just nudge it in a slightly different direction, then it's often surprising what can pop out when we take our data and just kind of pivot it different ways, as we'll see. So that's the focus of our time together today, is to see how to take advantage of this often overlooked feature. Just because the name pivot tables, it often gets a bad rap. By the end of our time together, I think you'll have a much better sense of how pivot tables can really help you transform your day-to-day work. I'd like to lead off with some background about my materials and my teaching style. I do try to accommodate you no matter what version of Excel you might be using, which could be Excel 2007, 10, 13, or 16. For the most part, much of what we talk about in this series will be equally applicable in the same form and fashion through all four versions of Excel. There is a menu, though, that has been renamed along the way, starting with Excel 2013. So I'll point that out to you, and then I have a convention I used so we can manage to keep straight where to click so that we're not having to juggle the names of these two different menus. I will be showing you everything at least twice. So I'll first show it to you on the PowerPoint slides, which have numbered steps. I'll then go to Excel 2016 and carry out those techniques firsthand. In the handout section of the platform there, you'll find where you can download the handouts for today, which include a PDF of today's presentation, as well as the example workbook. Sometimes that shows up off the screen, so you might have to scroll down to find that handout section. The example workbook does have links to articles I've written that relate to today's material, so I do try to leave you with lots of takeaways from choosing one of my presentations. As with many things in Excel, it is important for us to apply the right tool to a given job. And with pivot tables, the best data to work with is going to be data that is in the form of a list. And so there's a few ground rules that if we follow those ground rules, then we will have a good experience with our pivot tables in Excel. The first rule is that each column needs to have a unique title. Those titles are particularly important because those are how we're going to be building our reports. Excel is going to take those titles and serve them back to us in the form of a list that we can choose from, a field list. And so if the data that you're working with, if there's any confusion about the titles, meaning that you have two titles that have similar names, or maybe the field headings are rather cryptic, it's worth taking a moment to clean up those titles. It will give you a better experience with the pivot table. But also notice, if we look real close at the worksheet, that my titles are in a single row. It's very common for folks to have titles that extend over 2 or 3 rows, and that's in general one of the worst things that we can do to ourselves in Excel, because kind of the unwritten rule is that all of Excel's features work best when you have a single row of titles at the top. When you have multiple titles, such as maybe the word cases on one row, the word sold on the second row, same thing with total one row, sales on the second row. When we do things like that, we're unwittingly making Excel more difficult to use. Make sure the titles are present and in a single cell across the top. We also want to make sure that we don't see the words compatibility mode at the top of the screen. Compatibility mode signifies that we are using a spreadsheet that is compatible with Excel 2003. And a lot of software programs that maybe you're using an old program that you have not upgraded, or maybe it's just a program that hasn't kept up with the times, that lets us export lists of data over to Excel, but they do so still in the old compatibility mode format. And it's not going to be a deal breaker for you to head down that path, but you will have some unexpected frustration if you try to create a pivot table from a workbook that is presently in compatibility mode. Compatibility mode signals that for that workbook, it's going to be as if you're working back in Excel 2003. So cosmetically, your pivot table will look like it used to back in the day. Also, certain features related to pivot tables will be disabled because they had not been invented when Excel 2003 was around. So Excel protectively shuts them down because that information can't be saved to the file format. So to head all that off, if you just take your list and copy and paste it into a brand new workbook, that is one way to eliminate compatibility mode, and then you can embark on creating your pivot table. So within the body of the list, we want to make sure that there are no blank rows or blank columns. Blank rows and or columns in the middle of our spreadsheet will cause Excel to potentially not include all the data that we intend. So Excel works best when all of our cells are contiguous. So we want to make sure that they are all contiguous in that fashion. Step 4 shows that with regard to blank cells, if we have columns that have words in them, blank cells are permissible. We're not going to really run into a problem there. It's when we have columns of numbers that have blank, even one blank cell, that can cause our pivot tables to misbehave and have Excel count rows instead of summing them. So if you have blank cells, or if you have columns of numbers that have blank cells, good idea to fill in those blanks with zeros. It's not required, but again, it will improve upon your experience there. So here is our ideal data for working with a pivot table. We're going to see that here are our headings across the top. The situations to avoid are doing things like this, like cases and sold, total, and sales. Whenever you have 2 or more rows of headings, that's just going to bode some frustration in Excel, not only with pivot tables, but with sorting and many other things. So make sure that we keep all those headings in a single column there. If it's too wide to fit in a space, we can grab those cells and use the wrap text feature so that we wrap it so that then we can still see the whole heading. Notice in this case, it's still in a single worksheet cell in that fashion. So no blanks here and no totals there. So this list is in good shape for analyzing with a pivot table. Create a pivot table. The first step, we will select any cell within our list. Notice I did not go and highlight the whole spreadsheet. Typically for commands on the data menu, I will not need to go highlight everything. Excel can figure it out. So I click any cell within my list. Step 2, I go to the insert menu. Step 3, I'll choose the pivot table command. When I do so, that's going to bring up a create pivot table dialog box. And then step 4, we can click OK. Here in Excel, here's my list. Again, no need to highlight the whole thing. I can click any cell within that list, go to the insert menu, and then click the pivot table command. Notice that when I do so, when I do the steps in that sequence, Excel figures out where my data is. Now let's say I didn't do that. Let's say I was over on the side, just in a blank cell, and then I click on pivot table. Then suddenly I'm making Excel harder to use. I have to go and then highlight all the data and select down to the bottom of the list to populate that field there. So that is why when we are initiating a pivot table, we just simply click inside the list. Then we save that step of having to identify the data. We let Excel do that for us, and then we click OK. At this point, we see the beginnings of a pivot table. On the left-hand side, we see an empty canvas where our report will start appearing. On the right-hand side, we see a pivot table field list. At the top of the screen, we see 2 pivot table tools menus, one labeled Analyze, one labeled Design. As that nomenclature change, we can see that in Excel 2010 and earlier, the 2 pivot table tools menus were labeled Options and Design. And so as we go through the material, I'll simply refer to Options or Analyze as the first pivot table tools menu. So much of the time we'll be using commands from the first pivot table tools menu. That second menu is labeled Design. So when we utilize something on the Design menu, I will refer to it by its name. With the first menu, instead of saying Options or Analyze, I'll just refer to it as the first pivot table tools menu.